Sudan. A war. Written in the bones of history, the war raging in Sudan today is not just a clash between rival generals, it is the violent continuation of a long and tortured history, stretching back over a century. Sudan is a land defined by struggle, a battleground of empires, a crossroads of civilizations, and a canvas of deep-rooted ethnic, religious, and political scars. While the world watches with passing concern, the Sudanese people are enduring another chapter of suffering that echoes the ghosts of every conflict before it. The roots of this current war go beyond 2023 and lie in the very creation of Sudan as a modern state. During colonial times, especially under the British-Egyptian Condominium, 1899-1956, Sudan was governed not as a unified country, but as a region intentionally divided along ethnic and religious lines. The north was Arabized and Islamized, while the south was governed separately under Christian missionaries and animist traditions. This colonial divide-and-rule strategy created two nations within one border, fostering mistrust, inequality, and resentment that would explode after independence. When Sudan gained its independence in 1956, the new Arab-dominated northern government made no serious effort to include the southern population in the political process or national identity. The result was war, a civil war that began even before independence was officially declared. The First Sudanese Civil War, 1955-1972, was a brutal, grueling conflict, driven by the southern people's demand for autonomy and equality. It ended with a shaky peace deal, the Addis Ababa Agreement, which lasted only until the next betrayal. In 1983, when President Ghaffar Nimeri revoked the southern region's autonomy and imposed Sharia law nationwide, the Second Civil War ignited. This conflict lasted over 2 decades, becoming one of the deadliest wars since World War II, killing an estimated 2 million people and displacing more than 4 million. It was during this period that ethnic militias were first armed by the state, and the seeds of paramilitary violence were sown. The violence was not only political, it became cultural, religious, and racial. The government in Khartoum viewed many southern and western Sudanese as inferior, and warfare was used as a method of social cleansing and control. Following the 2005 peace agreement and the eventual secession of South Sudan in 2011, many hoped Sudan would find peace, but the fractures remained. In the west, the Darfur region exploded into conflict in 2003 when African rebel groups demanded an end to their political and economic marginalization. In response, the Sudanese government unleashed one of the most terrifying campaigns of ethnic cleansing in modern memory. The Janjaweed, Arab militias on horseback, burned entire villages, raped thousands of women, and killed hundreds of thousands, mainly targeting the non-Arab Masalit, Fur, and Zaghawa tribes. The world called it genocide, and for the first time in history, the sitting president of a country, Omar al-Bashir, was indicted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. But Bashir remained in power for another decade, and the men who carried out these atrocities, like Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemedti, were rewarded with promotions, wealth, and state protection. Hemedti, once a camel trader from Darfur, rose through the ranks to become one of the most powerful men in Sudan, leading the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, a formalized evolution of the Janjaweed. Under the guise of security, the RSF was deployed across the country, especially in gold-rich regions and restive provinces. Meanwhile, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, a career military officer, led the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF. In 2019, following months of massive street protests driven by youth, women, and workers demanding freedom and democracy, the regime of Omar al-Bashir collapsed. A transitional government was formed, composed of civilian and military leaders. For a brief, fragile moment, hope returned to Sudan. People dreamed of democracy, justice, and a Sudan for all, but that hope was soon betrayed. The military never truly relinquished control. In 2021, a coup led by Burhan dissolved the civilian cabinet. Tensions between Burhan and Hemedti simmered, both vying for dominance over Sudan's future, its resources, and its international alliances. By April 2023, those tensions exploded into open warfare between the SAF and RSF. What began as a power struggle in the capital, Khartoum, quickly metastasized into a nationwide civil war. The fighting spread to Darfur, Kordofan, and other already scarred regions. Civilians were slaughtered, homes bombed, hospitals raided, and ancient cities reduced to rubble. Reports of ethnic massacres in West Darfur, especially against the Masalit, echo the genocidal horrors of 2003-2005. Refugees fled in every direction, toward South Sudan, Chad, Egypt, some walking hundreds of kilometers through the desert, with nothing but fear and starvation. This war, though presented by international media as a clash of generals, is far more than a political rivalry. It is the product of decades of unresolved national trauma. It is the cost of justice deferred, of allowing warlords to govern, of ignoring the cries of Darfur, of empowering militias instead of building a state. It is the legacy of British imperialism, Arab supremacist ideology, dictatorship, and the deliberate exclusion of millions from power and dignity. Sudan is not just bleeding, it is reliving its nightmares. Over 150,000 people have died, entire towns have been ethnically cleansed, and millions are starving. And yet the world looks away, distracted by other headlines, ignoring that a nation is collapsing in real time, until Sudan's historical wounds are confronted with honesty, until war criminals face justice, and until power is shared among all of Sudan's peoples, Arab and African, Muslim and Christian, Northern and Southern. This cycle of war will not end. What is unfolding today is not a new war. It is history, unhealed, enraged, and exploding again across a land too often forgotten. Ukraine. The echoes of empire and the battle for sovereignty. The war in Ukraine is not simply a modern conflict between two nations. It is the resurgence of centuries-old imperial ambitions, national identity struggles, and the unfinished collapse of empire. To understand why Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014 and again in full force in 2022, one must first peel back the layers of history that stretch deep into the roots of Eastern European civilization. Ukraine has always existed at a crossroads, between Europe and Asia, Catholicism and Orthodoxy, freedom and domination. It has served as the breadbasket of empires, the frontier of kingdoms, and the target of foreign domination, especially by Moscow. Historically, Ukraine was not an extension of Russia but a foundational pillar of Eastern Slavic civilization. The medieval state of Kievan Rus, established in the 9th century, was centered in what is today Ukraine, with Kiev as its capital. It was from here that Orthodox Christianity was adopted in 988 AD, shaping the cultural and religious identity of the Slavic world. However, after the Mongol invasions in the 13th century, Kievan Rus fractured. While parts of present-day Ukraine fell under Polish-Lithuanian control, others were gradually absorbed by the rising Russian Empire. Over the centuries, Russia rewrote the history of Kievan Rus to claim it as the origin of the Russian state, thus justifying their ideological narrative that Ukraine and Russia are one people. This myth would become the backbone of Russian imperialism and modern-day aggression. Ukraine's struggle for independence has been marked by blood and betrayal. During the 20th century, it suffered some of the worst horrors imaginable. Under Joseph Stalin, millions of Ukrainians perished during the Holodomor, a man-made famine in 1932-33, orchestrated by the Soviet regime to crush Ukrainian nationalism and resistance to collectivization. The famine was an act of genocide, with grain requisitioned and villages sealed off to starve. In parallel, Ukrainian intellectuals and clergy were purged in waves of repression. During World War II, Ukraine became a battleground once again, occupied by both Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union, leading to mass killings, deportations, and the Holocaust's extension into Ukrainian territory. When the Soviet Union reasserted control, Ukraine became a Soviet republic, but its people never forgot their yearning for independence. The Soviet collapse in 1991 offered Ukraine a historic opportunity. The country declared independence, and a new democratic identity began to form. However, the transition was chaotic. Ukraine remained tethered to Russia economically and culturally, while simultaneously trying to align with the West. This push and pull created a geopolitical tension that Moscow never tolerated. When Ukraine's pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, rejected a European Union deal in 2013, millions of Ukrainians took to the streets in what became known as the Euro-Maidan Revolution. They demanded democracy, sovereignty, and a future aligned with Europe. The government responded with violence, killing dozens, but the people did not back down. In early 2014, Yanukovych fled, and a new pro-European government was formed. That was the moment Putin moved. Claiming to protect Russian speakers and secure Russian interests, Russia invaded and illegally annexed Crimea in 2014, an act not just of territorial conquest, but symbolic domination. In eastern Ukraine, Russian-backed separatists ignited a war in the Donbass, leading to years of grinding conflict and over 14,000 deaths even before 2022. But this was only the beginning. In February 2022, Vladimir Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, hoping to topple the government in Kyiv within days. He expected weakness and division. Instead, he encountered fierce national resistance, led by a defiant President Volodymyr Zelensky, who famously refused to flee Kyiv, saying, "I need ammunition, not a ride." The war that followed shattered assumptions about modern warfare. Russian forces bombed civilian infrastructure, flattened cities like Mariupol, committed atrocities in places like Bucha, and targeted hospitals, schools, and power stations. Millions of Ukrainians fled across Europe as refugees, while millions more stayed to fight and survive. The world watched in horror, but also admiration. Ukraine, once dismissed by some as a weak post-Soviet state, revealed a national soul forged in resistance. Women joined territorial defense units, farmers towed away Russian tanks, and communities organized under constant shelling. In response, NATO countries poured in weapons and humanitarian aid, while Russia, isolated by sanctions, deepened its alliance with powers like China, Iran, and North Korea. This war is not just about borders. It is about the survival of a nation that has been attacked, denied, and repressed for centuries. It is a war about identity, Ukraine's right to exist as a sovereign democratic state, and Russia's refusal to let go of its imperial delusions. For Putin, Ukraine is a geopolitical wound that he believes must be closed. For Ukrainians, this is a war of liberation, and their struggle echoes the historic revolutions of Poland in the 19th century, France in the 18th, or Vietnam in the 20th. They are not only defending land, they are defending memory, language, dignity, and the future. The war in Ukraine is reshaping the global order. It has revived NATO, awakened Europe, exposed the limits of diplomacy, and reminded the world that even in the 21st century, empires still bleed and resist. What happens in Ukraine will not stay in Ukraine. It is a front line in the global contest between authoritarianism and democracy, between colonial nostalgia and national freedom. Ukraine today is not merely a victim, it is a symbol, a warrior nation standing at the gates of Europe refusing to fall. Gaza, a cage of fire and the cycle of unending war. The war in Gaza is not a sudden outburst of violence, it is the crescendo of over 7 decades of occupation, siege, dispossession, and human desperation. At its core, it is a war rooted in one of the most unresolved crises of the modern era, the creation of Israel in 1948, and the catastrophic displacement of the Palestinian people, known as the Nakba catastrophe. Nearly 750,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled during the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, and generations have since grown up in refugee camps, stateless, landless, and voiceless. Gaza, a narrow coastal strip of just 365 square kilometers, became one of the densest and most oppressed places on Earth. Over 2 million Palestinians live there today, mostly descendants of refugees, confined under a punishing Israeli blockade since 2007, with limited access to food, clean water, medicine, and basic freedoms. The Gaza Strip has often been likened to the world's largest open-air prison. Since the militant group Hamas took control in 2006-2007, after winning elections and violently ousting the rival Fatah faction, Israel and Egypt have imposed a suffocating siege. The stated aim was to contain terrorism, but the impact has been devastating for the civilian population. Unemployment soars above 50%, electricity is only available for hours a day, and hospitals are barely functional. Israel controls the airspace, maritime access, border crossings, and even the population registry of Gaza. Every few years, a new round of war erupts: 2012, 2014, 2021, and now, the deadliest by far, in October 2023. But this time, the war has reached a new level of horror. On October 7, 2023, Hamas launched a brutal surprise attack into southern Israel, killing around 200 people, mostly civilians, and taking hundreds of hostages. The attack, condemned internationally, was shocking in its scale and savagery. But Israel's response has unleashed a humanitarian catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. In the name of self-defense and eliminating Hamas, Israel began a relentless bombing campaign across Gaza. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to dust, hospitals were bombed, refugee camps hit, and over 34,000 Palestinians, many of them women and children, were killed by early 2025. The Rafah border crossing, Gaza's last lifeline, became a focal point of tragedy as displaced families sought shelter in tents under constant bombardment. International aid was blocked or minimal, and images of starving children, collapsed buildings, and mass graves echoed across the world. Israel claims it is targeting Hamas militants hiding among civilians. But to Palestinians and much of the global South, this is not a war. It is an occupation, a siege turned genocide, a campaign of collective punishment against an imprisoned population. Human rights organizations, including the United Nations, have warned of war crimes and possible ethnic cleansing. The trauma is generational. Children in Gaza are born into war, grow up under drones, and often die before ever leaving their neighborhood. In contrast, Israeli families live with trauma too: bomb shelters, air raid sirens, and the constant fear of rockets. But the asymmetry of power is clear. One side is a nuclear-armed state with one of the world's most advanced militaries, the other a stateless people living under siege. This war is not just about Hamas or terrorism. It is about the status of Palestine, international justice, and whether the world will continue to allow an entire population to be treated as expendable. For Israel, this war may secure short-term military goals. For Gaza, it is a battle for survival, identity, and recognition. And unless a political solution is found, one that ensures Palestinian rights, dignity, and sovereignty, this war will continue in cycles. Gaza is not a security problem. It is a political and moral crisis, demanding global courage, not silence. Myanmar, the forgotten battlefield of resistance and repression. While the world focuses on more visible conflicts, Myanmar's civil war burns silently, consuming lives, communities, and hopes. What began in February 2021 as a military coup against a fledgling democracy has spiraled into a nationwide war, a people's uprising turned armed revolution. The roots of Myanmar's conflict are as deep and tangled as its dense jungles: colonial wounds, ethnic exclusion, military dictatorship, and broken promises of democracy. Myanmar is not just a country in crisis. It is a battlefield where an entire population is fighting to break the chains of a military that has ruled with terror for most of the country's modern history. The seeds of this war were sown long ago. Under British colonial rule, Burma, as it was known, was carved up into a patchwork of ethnic zones and exploited for labor and resources. Independence in 1948 brought hope, but also division. The central Burman majority government failed to accommodate the demands of ethnic minorities like the Karen, Kachin, Shan, Chin, and Rohingya. By the 1950s, armed ethnic insurgencies had already begun. In 1962, a military coup established one of the world's longest-standing juntas. For nearly 50 years, the Tatmadaw, the Burmese military, ruled through fear, censorship, torture, and systematic ethnic cleansing. The Buddhist Burman elite dominated, while ethnic minorities were bombed, displaced, or forcibly assimilated. When Myanmar began a slow democratic transition in 2011, Many hoped the country was turning a page. Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi rose to power in 2015 after decades of house arrest. But even as democracy appeared to blossom, the military retained enormous power through a 2008 constitution it had written. In 2017, the world witnessed the darkest side of this military once more, the genocide of the Rohingya Muslims in Rakhine State. Villages were torched, women raped, over 700,000 fled to Bangladesh, and thousands were killed. Suu Kyi, once a symbol of peace, defended the military's actions, shattering her international image. But inside Myanmar, democracy still mattered to the people. That fragile hope was crushed on February 1, 2021, when the military staged a coup, jailing Suu Kyi and her party leaders after they won re-election. The people rose in fury. What began as peaceful protests, led by youth, teachers, doctors, and monks, was met with live bullets, mass arrests, and torture. Over time, the resistance became armed. Across the country, local militias known as People's Defense Forces, PDFs, emerged, joining with long-standing ethnic armed groups. This unlikely alliance has transformed the civil war into a nationwide revolution. Burmans and minorities fighting side by side to bring down the junta. The war has devastated Myanmar. Entire cities have become battlefields. The military has used airstrikes, arson, chemical weapons, and indiscriminate killings against civilians. Monasteries and churches have been bombed. Schools are now bunkers. Over 3 million people have been displaced and over 5,000 killed, many of them children. Yet the international community has largely turned away, distracted by other global crises. China and Russia continue to arm the junta, while Western nations offer little beyond sanctions and condemnation. But this war is not just destruction, it is resistance. It is the story of farmers who became fighters, of university students who joined the jungle insurgency, of ethnic rebels who once fought alone now united under a common dream, of federal democratic Myanmar. The people are not just resisting a Yaila coup, they are dismantling an old system of ethnic hierarchy, military dominance, and fear. In Myanmar, the world is witnessing a historic struggle not unlike Spain's Civil War, Vietnam's revolution, or South Africa's anti-apartheid fight. If the people win, it will be a victory not just for democracy, but for pluralism, dignity, and self-determination. But until then, Myanmar bleeds in silence, praying for the world to remember its forgotten war. The Red Sea conflict and the Houthi front. The war in Yemen, particularly the Houthi insurgency, is a catastrophe that has unfolded with a blend of regional rivalry, sectarian conflict, and political instability. This conflict, fought across the strategic terrain of the Red Sea, is a tragic reflection of Yemen's centuries-long history of tribal warfare, imperial conquest, and the ongoing struggle for sovereignty. What started as a local rebellion has escalated into one of the most complex and bloody wars of the 21st century, where outside powers intervene for their own geopolitical interests, while the Yemeni people pay the price. Yemen's historical context is vital to understanding the roots of the conflict. The region has long been a crossroads of civilizations, situated at the tip of the Arabian Peninsula, where the Red Sea meets the Gulf of Aden. Its strategic location has made it the site of countless invasions and foreign dominance. For millennia, Yemen was the home of powerful kingdoms, including the Himyarite and Sabaean civilizations, which dominated the incense trade routes. However, Yemen's unification and national identity have always been fragile. The ancient north, mainly the Zaidi Shia of the highlands, and the south, with a predominantly Sunni population, were often divided regionally, religiously, and tribally. When Yemen gained independence in 1962 after a violent overthrow of the monarchy, the country became a battleground between socialist forces in the south, supported by the Soviet Union, and royalist rebels in the north, backed by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. This ideological divide was exacerbated by the broader Cold War struggle. In the late 1980s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the reunification of Yemen, the tension between the North and South only deepened. Economic collapse, political corruption, and marginalization of the South created a volatile environment. The South, which had its own aspirations for autonomy, felt increasingly alienated and oppressed by the central government in Sana'a, leading to the Yemeni Civil War of 1994. The North, led by President Ali Abdullah Saleh, defeated the South and consolidated power. Under Saleh's rule, Yemen entered a period of authoritarianism, instability, and corruption. His government was constantly at odds with various factions, tribes, Islamists, and separatists, while increasingly reliant on Saudi Arabian support. Yemen's fragile political system was further undermined by the Arab Spring of 2011. Popular uprisings led to Saleh's eventual ouster, and a new government was established under Abdrabbu Mansour Hadi, backed by a fragile coalition of political and military factions. But this shift did not bring peace. Instead, it set the stage for the rise of Houthi rebels. The Houthi movement, officially called the Ansar Allah, is a Zaidi Shia political and armed group from the northern Sada region. Historically marginalized, the Zaidis had long sought a greater share of political power in Yemen, especially under the Sunni-majority government. The Houthis were originally a reactionary group to what they saw as the Sunni-dominated government of Saleh, who had previously tried to integrate Yemen more closely with the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia. In the wake of Saleh's departure, the Houthis, with their deep tribal and religious networks, began to gain influence. In 2014, the Houthis launched an insurrection against President Hadi, culminating in their occupation of the capital, Sana'a. Their swift military victory and the collapse of the central government shocked the world. The Houthi insurgency was perceived as a threat not just to Yemen, but to the wider Arab world. Saudi Arabia, perceiving the Houthis as an Iranian proxy, especially given their Shia sectarian affiliation, viewed their rise as a direct threat to its influence in the region. With the Houthis in control of Sana'a and effectively running much of the country, Saudi Arabia and a coalition of 8 Arab nations, including the UAE, launched a devastating military intervention in March 2015, aimed at restoring Hadi to power and rolling back Houthi influence. What followed was a catastrophic conflict, one that spiraled into a brutal war of attrition with little hope for peace. Airstrikes by the Saudi-led coalition pounded Yemeni cities, killing tens of thousands and leaving millions of civilians in dire conditions. The Houthis, armed by Iran, retaliated with missile strikes and drone attacks on Saudi cities and oil infrastructure. The war has since become an immense humanitarian crisis, marked by widespread famine, disease, and infrastructure collapse. The UN has described Yemen as the world's worst humanitarian disaster, with over 250,000 dead, and millions more living in poverty or displacement. The healthcare system has all but collapsed, with cholera, malnutrition, and COVID-19 ravaging the population. Over 4 million people have been displaced, and 80% of the population is in urgent need of humanitarian aid. The war's toll has decimated entire generations, and the people of Yemen, who have been caught between the crossfire of internal factions and foreign powers, have seen their once thriving land reduced to rubble. For the Houthis, this war is about survival and sovereignty. To them, the fight is not just against Saudi Arabia but against a perceived foreign occupation. They frame the struggle as a national liberation movement, seeking autonomy for their region and rejecting foreign interference, whether from Saudi Arabia or the West. Yet their tactics, including missile strikes, landmines, and sieges, have led to accusations of war crimes, as they have targeted civilian areas as well. In contrast, Saudi Arabia's heavy bombardment and blockade have only worsened the suffering of ordinary Yemenis, creating a deadlock where peace seems elusive. Yemen's geopolitical importance cannot be underestimated. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, where the Red Sea meets the Gulf of Aden, is one of the world's most critical choke points for global oil shipments and maritime traffic. Control over this passage has drawn in major powers, from the Gulf states to the U.S., which has offered logistical and intelligence support to the Saudi-led coalition. Iran's involvement in supporting the Houthis, while indirect, has fueled sectarian tensions, and the conflict has become a proxy war between Sunni-majority Saudi Arabia and Shia-majority Iran, further complicating any chances of peace. While the war rages on, Yemen has become a regional battleground, a microcosm of the larger Middle East power struggle, where the dreams of the people are crushed beneath the ambitions of foreign powers. The war in Yemen is an urgent cry for international intervention, an end to the violence, the humanitarian relief that the Yemeni people desperately need, and a political solution that can bring long-lasting peace. But as the conflict drags on, the prospects for a peaceful future grow increasingly bleak. Yemen has been torn apart by rival factions, foreign intervention, and an international community that has failed to adequately address the crisis. The Houthi Front, whether viewed as a resistance movement or an extremist faction, remains one of the most significant obstacles to Yemen's peace. Until Yemen's sovereignty is recognized, and until its people are allowed to rebuild their future without the weight of sectarianism and foreign interference, the war will continue to haunt the region. The Sahel conflict and the battle for West African stability. The Sahel region of West Africa is a land of vast deserts, rugged mountains, and parched savannas, but it is also a place of untold human suffering, political instability, and persistent violence. Stretching across the southern edge of the Sahara, the Sahel includes countries like Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad, and parts of Mauritania. Historically, the region has been a crossroads for empires, traders, and nomadic peoples, but in recent decades, it has become a battleground in one of the most complex and multifaceted conflicts in modern Africa. What started as local insurgencies has transformed into a deadly, multinational war, fought not only by local groups, but also by international forces seeking to stabilize the region. The Sahel has long been a region shaped by colonialism, ethnic fragmentation, and poverty. During the colonial period, European powers, primarily France, exploited the region's resources while drawing arbitrary borders that ignored ethnic, linguistic, and tribal boundaries. After independence in the 1960s, the new nations of the Sahel struggled with the legacies of colonialism, weak governments, fragile economies, and political instability. These challenges were compounded by the Sahelian droughts of the 1970s and 1980s, which deepened poverty and caused mass migration, especially among the region's pastoralist communities. Traditional livelihoods, such as herding and farming, were devastated, and competition for increasingly scarce resources became a root cause of conflict. Ethnic and religious tensions have long existed in the Sahel, but they were largely contained until the early 21st century. Islamic extremism, which was initially more of a distant threat in the broader context of North Africa, began to find fertile ground in the Sahel after the 2003 invasion of Iraq and the subsequent rise of al-Qaeda. As the Sahel became an arena for global jihadist movements, many local groups, disillusioned by corruption, poor governance, and the failure of state institutions, began to align themselves with international extremists. This created a dangerous synergy between Islamist militants, ethnic militias, and local rebel groups that would, over time, fuel an ever-expanding cycle of violence. The turning point for the Sahel came in 2012, when the Tuareg rebellion in Mali, fueled by long-standing grievances over marginalization and ethnic discrimination, spiraled out of control. The Tuareg fighters, seeking an independent state in northern Mali called Azawad, seized large swaths of territory. However, their rebellion was hijacked by Islamist groups such as al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, Ansar Dine, and the Movement for Oneness and Jihad in West Africa, Mujao, who quickly took over the northern regions, imposing a brutal form of Sharia law and destabilizing the country. The Tuaregs, initially seeking autonomy, found themselves sidelined by the extremist groups they had inadvertently allowed to take power. The chaos in Mali rapidly spread to neighboring countries. Islamist factions took advantage of the porous borders, weak states, and lack of central control to recruit fighters, establish safe havens, and launch cross-border attacks. In 2013, France intervened militarily in Mali with Operation Serval to stem the tide of jihadism, but the intervention was only a temporary solution. While France succeeded in pushing back the militants in the north, the underlying causes of instability remained unresolved. The conflict had already become a regional one, spilling into Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mauritania. In these countries, the state's inability to provide security, coupled with historical ethnic tensions, fueled the rise of local militias and separatist movements that increasingly aligned themselves with transnational jihadist organizations. As the conflict escalated, the Sahel's population paid an immense price. Over 30,000 people have been killed in the conflict by early 2025, with millions more displaced. Entire villages have been destroyed, with entire populations forced to flee across borders in search of safety. The region has become one of the most dangerous places for internally displaced persons, IDPs, and refugees. Schools, hospitals, and markets have all been targeted by extremists, forcing millions of children out of school and leaving entire communities without access to healthcare. In countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the absence of government control over large swaths of territory has allowed armed groups to take over key infrastructure, such as roads, schools, and airports, leaving civilians trapped in constant danger. The humanitarian crisis has been compounded by food insecurity, as climate change exacerbates the challenges of farming and livestock herding. Droughts, flooding, and desertification have made agriculture nearly impossible in some regions, forcing millions into poverty. Coupled with military blockades and the spread of conflict, food and medicine are in increasingly short supply. The World Food Program, WFP, has warned that millions are at risk of starvation. Women and children are particularly vulnerable, often targeted by extremist groups for exploitation, sexual violence, and forced recruitment. The Sahel is increasingly becoming a battleground for international powers. While France and its allies, including the United States, have been involved in military operations like Operation Barkhane, France's counter-terrorism mission in the Sahel, the conflict has demonstrated the limits of military intervention. The local governments of the Sahel, though backed by Western nations, have been unable to establish peace or provide security. French forces began withdrawing from Mali in 2022 after facing mounting resistance from local populations, and the growing influence of Russian mercenaries, such as Wagner Group forces, who have been contracted by the military junta in Mali. As the war expands, neighboring countries like Chad and Mauritania are being drawn deeper into the conflict. Chad's military, traditionally one of the region's most powerful, has been involved in operations in the central Sahel to battle extremist groups and stabilize the region, but the burden is heavy. Meanwhile, the United Nations and African Union continue to push for dialogue, but with little success. The G5 Sahel Joint Force, composed of Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mauritania, and Chad, was created to bolster regional security, but it has been hampered by a lack of resources, political divisions, and a fractured security situation. The United States and other Western nations have stepped up their support for counterterrorism efforts, including drone strikes, intelligence sharing, and military training. However, many in the Sahel view this foreign involvement with suspicion, as local governments are seen as proxies for foreign interests rather than true representatives of the people. The future of the Sahel remains uncertain, and the prospects for peace seem bleak. In the face of Islamist militancy, ethnic conflict, and climate change, many wonder whether the region will ever know true peace. What is clear, however, is that military intervention alone will not be enough. The solution must be holistic, involving not just security, but also political, economic, and social reforms. This means addressing the underlying grievances of the region's marginalized communities, especially ethnic minorities, and building local governance structures that prioritize the needs of the people. The Sahel's youth, many of whom are disillusioned and vulnerable to extremist ideologies, must be given the tools to thrive, through education, jobs, and opportunities for empowerment. The Sahel's future lies in the hands of its people, but it also demands a broader international commitment. Countries in the region need more than military aid. They need diplomatic support and a genuine push for inclusive governance. The road to peace will not be easy, but it is not impossible. If there is a collective commitment to empowering local communities, addressing regional disputes, and finally tackling the growing threat of climate-induced migration and resource scarcity. Until then, the Sahel will remain a volatile powder keg, its people trapped in the crossfire of forces beyond their control.